All right. So today we're kind of having a coincidentally Valentine's somewhat appropriate lesson in that there is kind of a romance is a strong word. But there's a guy and a girl and it ends in a marriage. So today we are talking about Ruth. So last time we did this lesson, we ended up not having enough time. So I kind of slimmed it down. And from last time, I mean like 3 years ago, right? So hopefully it works just as well this time. So let's dive into Ruth. All right, so what we have here, Ruth 1 1 through 9. Ruth 1 1 through 9. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant each of you May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud. All right, so this is a setup of the story. This takes place during the book of Judges. I don't know specifically when, but sometime during Judges, which we have been studying the past 3 or 4 Sundays, right? This story takes place. So this is before the kingdom, after the time of like Moses and Joshua. During that time when the judges, who were prophets of God, were overseeing Israel. So there was a famine. And so a Hebrew man took his wife and his sons, and he went to live in another country, Moab, because there was a famine in Israel, and he needed to find, work and food. Presumably there was food in Moab. So he goes there. He lives there a long enough time that his 2 sons marry women. It's not clear whether he dies before they marry. It kind of implies that because it says he died and she was left with their 2 sons. So they marry Moabite women, which was technically against the rules, right? Jewish men were expected to marry Jewish women because God, wants you to marry people of your same faith, right? Not just like to keep it in the family, but so that you're not led astray by other faiths and other idols and things like that. Because we see a lot of times in the Old Testament is when people marry outside their faith, they are very much influenced by their spouse's idols because often their spouse doesn't convert. Naomi was doing the best she could in Moab, and these 2 guys married 2 women, Orpah and Ruth. Fun fact, Oprah is named after Orpah, but there was a misspelling, and that's how she got the name Oprah. So they lived there 10 years, and then Mahlon and Chilion also die. So Naomi has no husband. She has no sons. It's her and 2 women. This is a very dangerous situation for her to be in. And I don't mean like dangerous like someone's going to murder her. I mean dangerous like women weren't allowed to provide for themselves. If you were a woman, you needed a husband or a son to work, to provide. Women were not allowed to work in the same way. Women did work, but they worked in support of their husband's business usually, and they worked over the oversight of a man. Nobody listened to a woman. So you couldn't just go out as a woman and start your own business, right? But if your husband had a business, you could work in his business. You were expected to. The whole family supported, right? So without a husband, at least she had her sons, but now she has no husband and she has no sons. So now you have these three widows, which is kind of like the bottom of the totem pole societally, right? So she hears there's food in Israel, and that's where she's from. So she's like, at this point, she has nothing in Moab. The famine seems to be over, so she's going to go back home because at least then maybe she can find her family there. Though it's been a long time, so I doubt her dad is still alive. And if she, doesn't have a brother who's willing to take her in, she's basically a charity case at this point. So she's heading back, and she's going to go back, but she's like, has these two women with her, her daughters-in-law, but they're not Jewish. Israel is not their homeland. Their homeland is Moab. So she tells them to stay. She's like, go home to your father's families, and maybe they'll find you another husband, right? Because remember, once again, marriage back then had very little to do with romance. I know we talked, that's why I said that this is kind of a Valentine's Day lesson, right? Marriage back then in many ways was a business transaction, and it was a way for women, there were many, it was a way of owning women and a way of protecting women. And so women, they had to have a husband to own property. So women couldn't own property. So if your husband died, you lost everything if you didn't have a son. And if you had a son, that stuff would go to your son. So these women have nothing. She's like, go home to your fathers. They're young enough. They have no children that their family might take them back. And maybe another man will still take them, because they're widows. That's an option. They wouldn't necessarily just be cast off into society necessarily, right? There was a chance that their families would still, have means enough to take care of them, or that there would be other people, maybe other men who were widowers, who had children, who had no wives, who might be looking for a wife, right? So she kisses them goodbye. There's a bunch of crying, because, they've been together for a long time. Ruth 1:14 through 18. At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging. So Ruth is like, no, I'm not leaving you. You're my family now. I left my family to marry your son. This is my family. So where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people are now my people. Your God will be my God. And I will be with you always. Naomi accepts her. What's funny is that sometimes this, set of verses can be taken out of context and viewed romantically. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I'll live too. For your God is my God. I knew a song and the next line would be, and that's how I'll be true to you. But this is not romantic, right? This is her mother-in-law. This is probably the greatest example of female friendship in the entire Bible. There are very few examples of female friendship in the Bible because we've talked about, the writers of the Bible were male and they didn't spend a lot of time on female characters. But here we have an example of a woman who refuses to leave her mother-in-law's side. Naomi is probably old. She may not be that old, but back then being like 45 to 50 is a lot older than being 45 to 50 is today, if that makes sense. They didn't have the same medicines. They didn't have the same abilities to, just take Tylenol if you're in pain. Life was harder back then. So being like 50 felt much older than being 50 would feel today. If she's even 50, Naomi could be, as young as like 40, depending on when she had her kids and when her kids got married, right? So Ruth doesn't want to like leave Naomi to the wolves to do this great journey back to Israel by herself, which could be dangerous, but could be dangerous to both of them. You know, travel back then was very dangerous. But Ruth wants to stay with Naomi, and so she goes with her. All right. Ruth 2, 1 through Ruth 2, 1 through 7. 7. I tried to say like 7 and Naomi at the same time. It didn't work. Ruth 2, 1 through 7. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does this young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." All right. So they are back in Israel now. They are living in Bethlehem, which is where Naomi's husband was from. But they are still poor widows. And as we talked about, widows basically have no way to make money. And they have no one who's going to look out for them. So they have to provide food for themselves. And the way that Ruth does this is she goes to glean in the fields. So what is gleaning? Gleaning is after the harvesters come through. They go through, they harvest the crop. But sometimes they miss things, right? Sometimes it's because it's like, oh, this doesn't seem good enough to us, so we're not going to pick it. Sometimes it's just because they're human and they didn't have the big equipment we have today, right? Ruth is basically going behind the people harvesting and picking up what she can find. The crop that's maybe not good enough to sell, the crop that's overlooked, the crop that may have fallen to the ground and be bruised, but when you're hungry, you'll eat a bruised apple, right? Not that it was apples, it's grain, right? This practice of gleaning is biblical. So in Levi 19, 9 through 10, it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." So Ruth is doing this both as a poor person and a foreigner, right? So God, laid down the law that when you harvest, don't go back a second time to pick up what you missed. Leave that for the poor. Now, I'm sure not everybody did this. Not everybody's willing to let go of profit, right? But Boaz seems to be a godly man. He allows her to, or his people who were harvesting the land, when Ruth approached them, they allowed her to glean. She asked permission. They said yes, and she went in the field behind them, and she has been there all day gleaning, except for a short rest, because what she can glean is all that she can provide for her and Ruth. Interestingly enough, I did watch a documentary recently about France and how gleaning was kind of making a comeback. But I think that's a lot less common in the United States. Because even with all of our fancy equipment, we still miss things sometimes, right? But yeah, so maybe gleaning's making a comeback. So Boaz he asks about this young woman. He says young woman, which is interesting, right? So Ruth is still very young, I imagine. She's probably still in her late teens, early 20s. She married Naomi's son and then he died. She didn't have a kid. Was that because, they couldn't have kids, or was that because they weren't married very long before he died? So she could be anywhere from her teens to early 20s. So she would be visually young looking. And so they wouldn't necessarily know by looking at her that she is a widow. Though in talking to her, they would know, because they would know who Naomi is. When she came back, she, told her whole family. So Ruth 8 through 15, Ruth 2, 8 through 15. Ruth 2, 8 through 15. I'm not sure I said that right. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting. Follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favors in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her." So Boaz talks to Ruth, and he basically promises her safety. He says, "Don't go to other fields. Stay here." Is that a warning? Are the other fields not as safe as his fields? I feel like it is, but possibly not. But he's like, basically like, stay here, hang out with the women who work for me, and then the men harvest. The women come after that, and then you will come after the women. And no one's going to lay a hand on you. No one's going to hurt you. No one's going to threaten you. Remember, it's dangerous to be a woman alone in the ancient world, especially someone like a widow with no one to protect you. Men could take advantage of you. They could hurt you because there was nobody to say otherwise. But now Boaz is here to say, no one in my field will hurt you. So you are safe here. Not only are you safe here, but when you're thirsty, you can get a drink from the same water jars that the men get drink from, the people who work from me. And she's like, wow, why? Why me? And he's like, because I know what you've done for your mother-in-law. Word gets around in ancient Bethlehem, probably because Bethlehem wasn't that big. And he knows how she left everyone behind to stay with Naomi, to be her family, to not leave Naomi alone. He thinks that because of that, she's a good person and she deserves good things. And so he hopes that the Lord will repay her for what she has done. And she's like, thank you. This brings me ease that you, are treating me like a servant, even though I don't even have the standing of a servant. And he's like, don't worry about it. And then even when it's mealtime, he offers her food. And he lets her eat like she's one of them. And he gives orders to his men to not harm her and to let her do what she needs to do, to glean amongst the fields. Not that, these men let her do it in the first place. So it seems like it's going to be fine. But if he had come in afterwards as their boss and been like, no, get rid of her, they would have, right? All right. Ruth 2, 17 through 23. Ruth 2, 17 through 23. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. I can't say this word. Ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our closest relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So Ruth tells Naomi everything, and Naomi is like, wow, that Boaz, he's a great guy, isn't he? She's like, this man is our nearest kin. He's our nearest relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers. Depending on your version of the Bible, there may be a different word used here, but if you look in your Bibles, there's a footnote symbol. If you were using one of the youth Bibles in the youth room, there would be a footnote symbol, and if you look down, it would say that word guardian redeemers means one who has the right to redeem. So what does that mean? We talk about redemption a lot in church, but when we talk about redemption, we're usually talking about Jesus and like our souls. That's very clearly not quite what's being talked about here, right? Naomi is like, Boaz is one of our redeemers. So this is clearly a slightly different context than how we talk about it when we talk about Jesus, right? So the word redeem can mean many things. For example, you can redeem a coupon. When I redeem a coupon, I am not saving its soul. It's not saving my soul. That means I took it to the grocery store and I redeemed it by using it, right? You can also say that in Star Wars, the character of Darth Vader is redeemed, or Anakin Skywalker is redeemed by the end of the story. So how can I both redeem a coupon and redeem Darth Vader? That's a great question. Well, it has to do with the meaning of the word, right? Redeem basically means to compensate for or save something from its faults, such as Darth Vader being redeemed. His character is saved, not in a Jesus sense, but he is brought back from, being a bad guy. He's brought back to the light. He is narratively redeemed in that he does that by saving his son's life. So the viewer who, watched Darth Vader murder a bunch of people 3 movies before now is all like, oh, Darth Vader likes Luke. He saved him, right? So you've narratively redeemed Darth Vader, even though he's not necessarily societally redeemed. And if Darth Vader had lived, it would have been really hard to reintegrate him in society, right? He probably would have gone to jail. But his character is saved, right? After a history of doing bad things. Redemption can also mean a thing regaining or gaining value. So when I redeem a coupon, it is gaining value, right? You could argue that Darth Vader regained his value when he came to the light. So that's how that word can both mean a coupon gained its value and Darth Vader regained his value, right? Before I used the coupon, it's just a piece of paper. After I used the coupon, it was money that got me a good, right? Before Darth Vader was redeemed, he was just a bad guy. After he was redeemed, he is a father who cares for his son, who gave his life for his son so that his son could live and allow the downfall of the empire, right? So in Ruth and Naomi's case, redemption would mean they would be saved from their destitute lives as childless widows. So in these ancient times, a kinsman redeemer was a relative who could redeem a poor person's inheritance. This is in Leviticus 25:25, which says, if one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. So their nearest relative is to buy it for them and basically give it back to them or hold it in trust for them. So in certain circumstances where there was no heir, which in this case there is no heir, right? Naomi's sons are both dead. Her sons had no sons. There is no heir. A kinsman redeemer could redeem the family by marrying the relative's widow to redeem the inheritance. A relative was not obligated to do this. They didn't have to do this. And if no relative chose to help, the widow would probably live in poverty for her entire life. So what Naomi is hoping for is that Boaz will redeem them by marrying Ruth. And so even though Boaz isn't Naomi's son, Ruth's first child, by Boaz, if they got married, would, for the sake of the inheritance laws, be considered Naomi's grandson, so that this child could inherit her husband's wealth, right? So that both women would be rescued out of their poverty and obscurity, right? Because if it was just that Boaz married Ruth and this law wasn't in place, then Boaz would have no obligation to care for Naomi. But if he marries Ruth and they have a child, that child would be considered Ruth's first husband's child. I know, this is complicated. But the reason for that is that would allow then for them to care for Naomi. Naomi would be considered part of the family. And all of the inheritance from Naomi's husband and Naomi's sons would get to go to this first child, presumably male, and the inheritance would be kept. Otherwise, the inheritance is lost to them and they get nothing. And this has actually happened in the Bible before. There's a story of Judah and Tamar. We didn't study it because it's weird. It's a weird story. But this was an ancient practice. So that is what, in a perfect world, they would like to have happen. All right, Ruth 3, 1 through 9. Ruth 3, 1 through 9. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. Don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are the guardian redeemer of our family." Okay, there's a lot here. I'm going to have to break it down for you because there's some euphemism going on in here. So Naomi suggests a crazy plan of Ruth basically sneaking into Boaz's bed that night. Now you're like, what? That's not quite what happened here. She slept at his feet. What's that? That's like my dog sleeps at the foot of my bed, right? No, that's not what's happening here. So you guys know what a euphemism is, right? That's when I use a phrase to mean a different phrase. When you're uncomfortable saying something, like, for example, they had sex. We might say they slept together instead. That would be a euphemism, right? Because people are uncomfortable with the word sex, and slept with seems much more benign, you know? But if you were reading this and you were an alien and you said they slept together, you might be like, okay, my dog slept in my bed last night. What does that mean? Right? Like, it's meaningless if you don't know the euphemism. So there's some interesting things going on here with euphemisms. So we're going to pick them apart. The first off is that Boaz finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits. You guys, that means he's drunk. Okay. That means he had a little too much to drink. He's little, he may not be like pass out drunk. But he's got a buzz going on, and a little loosey goosey with his inhibitions. He's feeling good. This is why we don't get drunk, you guys. So he doesn't even go home. He goes to lie over on the far end of the grain pile. Then Ruth approaches him quietly, uncovers his feet, and lay down. I have read that uncovering the feet is also a euphemism for other parts of the body, and basically like getting him naked, right? So you could argue that euphemistically what is happening here is that Ruth is making it seem like they slept together, to use an American euphemism. So that, he would be like, oh my gosh, did I take advantage of this woman? Which is a weird thing. It's a weird thing. It's a weird plan. she's like, so he wakes up and he's like, oh my gosh, there's a woman sleeping next to me. And I don't dream. Did I do this? Like, I don't remember. Oh my gosh, I had a lot to drink. Did I have too much to drink? Was I blackout drunk and now I don't remember that I slept with this woman? Possibly. So he's like, who are you? And she's like, I'm Ruth, remember? The poor widow. Spread your garment over me. And wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You're my guardian redeemer. Yeah. This is a weird plan. This is an audacious plan. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. So Ruth 3:10 through 13. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed me earlier, for you have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than you. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it too. Lie here until morning. And so he's like, oh, well, I'm your guardian redeemer, so I can take care of this. We'll just get married. It's fine. Because you remember also back then, he could have lots of wives, so it really doesn't matter as long as he has the money to take care of them all. For all we know, he already has another wife. But he's like, oh, you went after me, who's old, instead of younger men. Though, of course, Boaz is rich, so I'm not sure Ruth should get much credit there. But, really, this is all Naomi's plan. He's like, don't be afraid. I'm going to take care of you. I'm not taking it. He probably thinks he slept with her. So he's like, I'm not taking advantage of the situation. I'm going to make sure you're taken care of, whether it's by me or the other relative who's more closely related to you than I am. So stay the night here, but in the morning, I'm going to go talk to this other guy, because technically he has first dibs to do his duty by you, to redeem you. But if he doesn't do it, I will. Because you can't just jump the line like that, right? To be a guardian redeemer, you had to be the closest kin. There were rules about it. Interestingly enough, I mean, we don't consider a guardian redeemer, but even as recently as World War I and World War II, there'd be things happen like, two brothers go to war, one of them dies, the other comes back and marries his brother's widow so that woman can be taken care of, right? So this is not, that's kind of a similar idea. So Ruth 3:14. So she lay at his feet until morning and got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. So this is where we're going to pause and talk about the scandalousness of this whole craziness that just happened in the Bible. As we've talked about before, the Bible is not PG-13. It's very rated R. Though this story is at least written in a PG-13 manner. So our first reaction is obviously, well, that's so scandalous. Like everything I just told you is so scandalous, right? She basically convinced this guy that they may or may not have had sex, right? But then you might be like, well, it can't be that scandalous if a virtuous woman of a Bible did it, right? But no, it is indeed that scandalous. Ruth took her reputation into her own hands. And back then, reputation is a big deal, right? Today, it's different. Thank goodness, right? There's very little you can do, short of ending up in jail, to irreparably harm your character in a way that's going to follow you for the rest of your life. But that was not true back then. This is very scandalous. She was taking her reputation in her hand, maybe Boaz's reputation, but remember, men's reputations couldn't be hurt as much. Even though in the Bible it says do not commit adultery, if a man was committing adultery, most people would be like, who cares? Because that's the patriarchy for you, which we'll see more when we get to King David. So mostly it was her own reputation. However, they didn't actually do anything wrong, but she kind of convinced him they might have done something wrong. I mean, she didn't say they did anything wrong. She just set up a scenario where he could be like, did I do something wrong? I don't know, man. I don't know. So there's this idea in most societies of something we call propriety, which basically means conforming to conditionally accepted standards of behaviors and morals. Sometimes we confuse societal standards with sins or things that are wrong in God's eyes. But sometimes societal standards are just societal standards. And to follow God's plan for our lives, sometimes we have to break societal standards. We saw this with Jesus. Jesus hung out with all sorts of people. It went against propriety for Jesus to hang out with prostitutes and tax collectors. But that is what he did, you know. So in a middle school sense, the propriety of middle school is very different from the propriety of society. It can be much stricter and also weirder. There are different rules in middle school. And if you break those rules, sometimes you get marked a social outcast. Sometimes people just laugh. Sometimes rumors can spread about you. But those rules are just middle school's rules. They're not God's rules, right? In Ruth's society, obviously, sneaking into a man's bedroom in the middle of the night would be seen as basically an act of prostitution. Even though we as the reader know she didn't do anything sexual with Boaz. So I'm not saying you should be sneaking into people's bedrooms. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not even saying that you should hang out with people you shouldn't. We talk about peer pressure, and you have to know the strength of your character, right? Jesus obviously was a very strong person. He had a very strong character. I know myself, and I know I do what I want, right? I am not usually susceptible to peer pressure. Some of us are more susceptible to peer pressure. So hanging out with people who might lead us astray could lead us astray, right? So you kind of have to know your own limits sometimes. And middle school is kind of when we determine those limits, because a lot of times falling prey to peer pressure in middle school isn't dangerous. It leads to like wanting to wear different clothes as opposed to doing drugs. Don't do drugs. Regardless, what I'm saying is that sometimes following Jesus requires us to do things that society might view as wrong, but we know is right. The ultimate authority we follow in society is the ultimate authority we follow is not society's view of politeness, but rather God's views. This is why we shouldn't be so quick to judge people when they seem to be going outside of what we think is appropriate for society. You don't always really know what's going on. Just like an outside observer would have mistaken what was going on with Ruth and Boaz, which is why here, he's like, no one must know a woman was here. This is also why it's really important that we don't spread rumors or gossip, because you don't know what's going on, right? So if you're spreading rumors that imply people did things that they may or may not have done, what are you doing? You're not helping the situation. You're just maliciously spreading things. So, our number one allegiance is to God. Sometimes God asks us to do things that society may not approve of. And that's just reality. All right. We don't have a lot of time left. So, Ruth 3:16 through 18. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for him and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." So she goes back to Naomi. She reports back everything. Meanwhile, Boaz actually gets down to business and meets the other people in the city and sees who else Ruth's kinsman redeemer is and if they want to redeem Ruth. And the answer is no, they don't. That they are fine with Boaz doing it. Now, we're going to skip that though because we're running out of time. And he pledges before everyone he's going to do this. So Ruth 4:13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they called him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So Boaz and Ruth get married and have a baby named Obed. And Naomi is basically the grandmother of this baby. So, at the beginning, Naomi was very bitter. God had taken everything away from her. She lost her husband. She lost her sons. She had nothing. But by the end of it, because of her and Ruth's faithfulness to each other, their faithfulness to God, their whole family was redeemed. Obed would not, from an inheritance perspective, is Naomi's grandson. So Naomi has a family again. And this directly sets us up for King David. So this is kind of the segue to Samuel. So what's so important about Ruth? Why is there the entire book of the Bible dedicated to her? Well, one, as we already talked about, she directly sets up King David. King David is kind of like the biblical King Arthur, if you know anything about King Arthur. So he's kind of important. Her story also directly reflects how the laws to protect and redeem the poor are used to do just that, and an example of faithful men and women following God's laws and their faith being rewarded. But perhaps the biggest thing to take out of this from a Christian sense is that Christians often view this story as a metaphor for our relationship with Jesus. Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. He is the person who redeems us. Theologian Dr. Leggett explains, as Boaz had the right of redemption and yet clearly was under no obligation to intervene on Ruth's behalf, so it was with Christ. As Boaz, seeing the plight of the poor widows, came to their rescue because his life was governed by Yahweh and his laws, so also of the Messiah it is prophesied that his life would be governed by the law of God, and that he would deal justly and equitably with the poor and with those who were oppressed. Jesus redeemed us, just as Boaz redeemed Ruth and Naomi and their whole line. But the difference between Jesus and Boaz is that Jesus redeems us in both sense, right? He brings us back to the light in a Darth Vader sense, but he also redeems us like a coupon. His redemption gives us even more value, which isn't to say you don't have value without Jesus. Jesus' love applies to all of us. But it makes us more than just a piece of paper, right? We were always something. We were always something of worth. But now instead of a piece of paper, your diapers or whatever you redeemed the coupon for. I'm sorry. I just compared you to diapers. I don't know. It's the first thing that came to my head that you use a coupon for. All right. And that's it. So next we're actually going to start kind of the king cycle in the Bible with Samuel. So it's actually going to take us a little bit to get to a king, but we're going to see how that happens and how we get there. And it'll be, King David's one of the biggest characters in the Old Testament outside of Moses. So it's going to be interesting. All right, let me stop the recording.